The summer heat of 1959 hung thick in the air at Metropolitan Hospital in New York City. In room 6A, a frail woman lay dying, her once powerful voice reduced to whispers. Outside Billie Holiday's window, hundreds of fans clutched white gardenias, the flowers she had made famous, the flowers that had become her signature. They wept openly, singing her songs in hushed voices, their voices carrying through the muggy air like a final choir for a fallen angel. But inside that sterile room, police officers stood guard, not to protect her, but to arrest her the moment she recovered enough to be taken into custody. Steel handcuffs cut into her wrists as nurses tried to find veins collapsed from decades of needle use. The world called her Lady Day, the voice of a generation, the woman who had sung America's conscience into existence. But her own country had labeled her something else entirely. Enemy of the state. File number 56, HQ 12204, a threat to national security whose crime was singing the truth, whose punishment was a slow, deliberate destruction disguised as justice. As gardenias piled higher outside the hospital, those pristine white flowers that had once adorned her hair during performances. Inside that room, federal agents reviewed their files one final time. 20 years of surveillance, thousands of pages of reports, hundreds of photographs, all to destroy one black woman whose voice had the power to make America weep for its sins. The official cause of death would be listed as cirrhosis of the liver, but those who knew understood the real truth. Billie Holiday had been murdered by the very country she had spent her life trying to heal through song. Was this really how America chose to honor one of its greatest artists? What if the woman they were destroying had been their only hope of healing the very wounds she sang about? But to understand how Lady Day became enemy number one, we must travel back to a time when she was just Eleanora Fagan, a scared little girl in Baltimore whose voice would become both her salvation and her curse. The year was 1915, and America was a nation built on contradictions. While the Constitution promised equality, the reality was Jim Crow laws that made second-class citizenship legal for millions of black Americans. In the Baltimore of Eleanora's birth, these contradictions weren't abstract concepts. They were daily humiliations that shaped every aspect of life. Eleanora was born to Sadie Fagan, a 13-year-old girl who was still a child herself when she became a mother. The father, Clarence Holiday, was a traveling musician who drifted through their lives like smoke, present just long enough to fill their cramped apartment with guitar melodies before disappearing again into the night. The music he left behind became young Eleanora's first language, a way of understanding emotion that words couldn't capture. The Baltimore row house where they lived was a monument to America's racial hierarchy. While white families lived in comfortable homes with running water and electricity, black families like the Fagans were crammed into buildings where disease and desperation thrived. Sadie worked multiple jobs, scrubbing floors for white families, taking in laundry, doing whatever it took to keep food on the table. Often, young Eleanora was left alone for hours, wandering streets where violence and poverty were as common as the humid summer air. By age 6, Eleanora had witnessed things that would haunt her forever. She saw men beaten by police for the crime of walking while black. She watched families evicted from their homes with nowhere to go. She learned that in America, the color of your skin determined not just where you could live, but whether you were allowed to dream. Yet something inside her refused to be broken. When life became unbearable, she would sneak up to the windows of jazz clubs, pressing her face against the glass to catch glimpses of the magical world inside. The musicians seemed to possess a secret knowledge. They could take pain and transform it into something beautiful, something that made people forget their troubles, if only for a few minutes. It was music that saved her when everything else failed. At age 10, When Sadie could no longer afford to keep her, Eleonora was sent to live with relatives who saw her as a burden rather than a child. The house was crowded, food was scarce, and affection was non-existent. But in the evenings, when the adults were drinking and arguing, Eleonora would sing, first to herself, then softly to anyone who would listen. Her voice, even at that young age, had an unusual quality. While other children sang with the innocent clarity of youth, Eleonora's voice carried weight, as if she had lived lifetimes already. Neighbors would stop their conversations to listen when she sang spirituals or the popular songs she heard on the radio. There was something in her voice that spoke to their own hidden pain, their own secret dreams. The turning point came when she was 14, the age when most girls were worried about school dances and first crushes. But Eleonora faced a choice no child should ever have to make: watch her mother starve or sacrifice her own innocence to keep them both alive. With no other options, she began working as a prostitute in a Baltimore brothel, her childhood ending not with ceremony but with the cold transaction of survival. The brothel was a microcosm of America's racial and sexual exploitation. The clients were mostly white men who saw black women as objects to be used and discarded. The other girls, some barely older than Eleonora herself, had given up hope of any other life. But even in that hellish environment, Eleonora found music. She began singing for the clients, not on stage, but in the background, her voice floating through the rooms where men came to forget their own moral failures. What happened next revealed the transformative power that would define her entire career. When Eleonora sang, the atmosphere in the brothel changed. Clients would stop what they were doing and listen. The other girls would gather around, finding moments of beauty in their nightmare. Her voice had the almost supernatural ability to transform any space, no matter how degraded, into something approaching sacred. But it was also here that Billie Holiday first learned the cruel mathematics of survival that would shape her entire life. In America, a black woman's body could be bought and sold, her spirit could be broken and brutalized, but her voice, if it was powerful enough, could become a weapon that even her oppressors feared. Everything changed in 1929 when Sadie made the desperate decision to take her daughter to New York City. The Harlem Renaissance was in full swing, and the neighborhood pulsed with a creative energy that seemed to offer possibilities that Baltimore never could. For 15-year-old Eleonora, now calling herself Billie Holiday after her favorite actress Billy Dove, Harlem was a revelation. Here, being black wasn't just tolerated, it was celebrated. The Cotton Club showcased the best jazz talent in the world, though it maintained the twisted tradition of allowing only white patrons to enjoy black artistry. The Apollo Theater launched careers that would define American music for generations. Small clubs lined every street, each one a laboratory where musicians experimented with new sounds, new rhythms, new ways of expressing the inexpressible. But even in this cultural paradise, survival was a daily struggle. Billie and her mother lived in a tiny apartment with no heat, sharing beds with strangers to make rent. Sadie continued working as a domestic, while Billie desperately searched for any way to use her voice to earn money. The jazz clubs that seemed so glamorous from the outside had their own harsh realities. Most were controlled by organized crime, and young black women were often seen as entertainment in more ways than one. Billie's break came through desperation rather than opportunity. Hungry and with no money for food, she walked into Pod's and Jerry's, a small club in Harlem, and asked if she could sing for tips. The piano player, probably amused by this thin teenager with fierce eyes and a gardenia in her hair, began a simple melody. What happened next changed the course of American music. When Billie opened her mouth, something extraordinary emerged. Her voice had developed far beyond the promising talent of her childhood. It now carried the weight of everything she had experienced, every pain she had endured, every moment of beauty she had glimpsed in the darkness. She sang "Travelin' All Alone," and by the time she finished, the entire club had fallen silent. Her technique was unlike anything anyone had heard. While other singers of the era focused on power and range, Billie's strength lay in her ability to inhabit a song completely, to make each lyric feel like a personal confession drawn from the depths of her soul. She sang behind the beat, stretching phrases in ways that shouldn't have worked but somehow created new meanings in familiar melodies. But there was something else that set Billie apart, something that would prove both her greatest gift and her ultimate curse. She possessed an almost supernatural ability to channel pain through her voice in a way that transformed it into something beautiful and shared. When she sang about heartbreak, audiences could hear their own broken hearts. When she sang about loneliness, she gave voice to every person who had ever felt abandoned by the world. Word spread quickly through Harlem's tight-knit jazz community. Within weeks, musicians were seeking her out not just for her voice, but for what she brought to their music. She had an uncanny ability to find new meanings in familiar songs, to discover emotional depths that composers hadn't even realized they had written. When she sang Gershwin's "Summertime," it wasn't a lullaby anymore. It became a meditation on the brief, precious moments of peace that poverty-stricken mothers could offer their children before the world intruded again. The recording industry of the 1930s was a reflection of America's racial hierarchy. Black musicians were paid a fraction of what their white counterparts earned, and their music was often dismissed as race records, entertainment for black audiences that white society could safely ignore. But Billie's talent was too powerful to be contained by these artificial boundaries. Her first recordings with Benny Goodman in 1933 revealed an artist already fully formed at age 18. Your Mother's Son-in-Law showcased her revolutionary approach to melody and rhythm, but it was the B-side that hinted at her true potential. Riffin' the Scotch was a throwaway song, but Billie transformed it into something magical, finding soulful depths in lyrics that other singers might have treated as mere nonsense. The real breakthrough came through her association with producer John Hammond, a wealthy white music lover who had dedicated his life to breaking down racial barriers in the music industry. Hammond understood that Billie wasn't just another talented singer. She was a revolutionary artist who could transform American music if given the opportunity. The recording sessions Hammond arranged between 1935 and 1942 produced some of the finest jazz vocals ever captured. Working with small ensembles led by pianist Teddy Wilson, Billie recorded songs like "What a Little Moonlight Can Do" and "Miss Brown to You" that showcased not just her voice, but her revolutionary approach to interpreting lyrics. But it was during this period that Billie also developed the visual signature that would become as famous as her voice. The gardenias she wore in her hair during performances created a striking image. White flowers against dark skin, beauty emerging from pain, elegance surviving despite everything the world could throw at it. Yet, like everything else in Billie's life, even this beautiful tradition carried hidden meanings. She had chosen gardenias for their powerful scent, which helped mask the smell of the marijuana she increasingly relied upon to cope with anxiety and the crushing pressure of performing night after night. The flower that made her look like royalty was, in truth, her first disguise, beauty concealing the beginning of a destruction that would consume her. What twisted irony that the symbol of her elegance would become the emblem of her rebellion against a world determined to break her spirit. The real turning point came in 1938 when Barney Josephson, a wealthy Jewish socialist, opened Café Society in Greenwich Village, billing it as the wrong place for the right people. It was Manhattan's first truly integrated nightclub, where black and white patrons sat together as equals, a revolutionary concept in pre-war America that challenged every assumption about how race should work in entertainment. Josephson had heard about Billie through the jazz underground and offered her a regular engagement. For the first time in her career, she wasn't just the featured vocalist with someone else's band. She was the star. Night after night, she commanded the stage at Cafe Society, developing the intimate conversational style that would become her trademark. She would lean against the piano, close her eyes, and let each song unfold like a private conversation with every person in the room. It was at Cafe Society that Billie first encountered Abel Meeropol, a Jewish schoolteacher from the Bronx who moonlighted as a songwriter under the pseudonym Lewis Allen. Meeropol had written a poem called Bitter Fruit, inspired by a photograph of a lynching that had haunted him for months. He had set the poem to music, creating a song unlike anything in American popular music. A 3-minute indictment of racial violence that spoke in metaphors but hit like a physical blow. When Meeropol first approached Billie about the song, she was performing I Cover the Waterfront to a packed house. He waited until her set ended, then cornered her at the bar. Without preamble, he sat down at the piano and began to play. The melody was simple, almost hymn-like, but the words that emerged were anything but peaceful. Southern trees bear a strange fruit, blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Billie listened in stunned silence. She had grown up hearing whispered stories about lynchings, had seen the fear in her mother's eyes when such news reached Baltimore. But no one had ever dared to sing about it. Not like this, not with such unflinching clarity. When Meeropol finished, the usually voluble Billie was speechless. "I can't sing that," she finally whispered. "They'll kill me." But even as she spoke the words, she knew she was lying. The song had already taken root inside her, connecting with every injustice she had witnessed, every indignity she had endured. That night she went home to her small apartment and sang Strange Fruit over and over until the sun rose, each repetition revealing new layers of meaning, new depths of rage and sorrow. The decision to perform Strange Fruit publicly was not made lightly. Billie understood the risks, not just to her career but to her life. Lynching was still a brutal reality in 1939 America, and the perpetrators rarely faced consequences. By singing about it, she was not just commenting on racial violence, she was making herself a target of the same forces that created the strange fruit hanging from southern trees. Josephson supported her decision but insisted on specific protocols that would transform the performance into something approaching a religious ritual. Strange Fruit would be the final song of every set. The room would be completely darkened except for a single spotlight on Billie. No one could order drinks or move during the performance. When the song ended, she would leave the stage immediately. No encores, no applause, just silence, and the weight of what had been heard. The first performance was on a cold February night in 1939. The usual chatter of the crowd died as the lights dimmed. Then Billie's voice emerged from the darkness, transformed by the gravity of what she was singing. The gardenia in her hair seemed to glow under the spotlight. A white flower singing about Black Death, beauty confronting barbarity in the most intimate possible way. The reaction was unlike anything anyone in the room had ever experienced. Some audience members wept openly. Others sat in stunned silence, their comfortable assumptions about American civilization shattered by 3 minutes of uncomfortable truth. A few walked out, their evening's entertainment ruined by the intrusion of reality. But those who stayed understood they had witnessed something unprecedented, the birth of the protest song as an art form. Here was a black woman adorned with white gardenias like a crown, singing about black bodies hanging from trees, the ultimate symbol of white supremacy's brutality. The visual alone was a form of protest, beauty confronting horror, elegance challenging barbarity, art refusing to look away from atrocity. Within weeks, word had spread throughout New York's artistic and intellectual community. Writers like Langston Hughes and James Baldwin began flocking to cafe society not just to hear great jazz, but to experience something they had never heard before. A black woman singing America's most shameful secrets with unflinching honesty. The song became more than entertainment. It became a form of witness, a musical testimony to crimes that polite society preferred to ignore. But while audiences left her performances emotionally shattered, FBI agents in the crowd took notes with different purposes. In their reports, they described Billie Holiday not as an artist, but as a communist sympathizer and threat to American values. The same song that moved people to tears was classified by the government as inflammatory propaganda. Could there be a more perfect illustration of America's schizophrenia? A nation simultaneously moved and terrified by its own conscience? The FBI files on Billie Holiday, released decades later through Freedom of Information Act requests, reveal the scope of the government's obsession with her. Agents attended her performances, photographed her associates, and compiled detailed reports on her personal life. They noted not just her political activities, which were minimal, but her relationships, her habits, even her choice of clothing. The Bureau was building a case not just against her actions, but against her existence as a powerful black woman who refused to be silenced. Harry Anslinger, the commissioner of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, took a personal interest in Billie's destruction. A Southern-born prohibitionist with deep racist convictions, Anslinger saw the war on drugs as a way to control populations he deemed threatening. Jazz musicians with their integrated audiences and countercultural lifestyle represented everything he despised about modern America. In his private correspondence, Anslinger wrote about jazz music as a satanic influence that corrupted white youth and gave black Americans dangerous ideas about equality. He saw Billie Holiday as the perfect target, a black woman whose music reached white audiences, whose songs challenged racial hierarchy, whose very existence proved that talented black artists could compete with anyone. Anslinger's strategy was insidious in its simplicity. Rather than attack Billie directly for her political voice, which might have created a martyr and drawn attention to the government's racial motivations, he would destroy her through the back door of drug enforcement. He assigned his best agents to infiltrate her inner circle, to document her drug use, and to build an airtight case that would remove her from public life permanently. The most devastating of these agents was a black federal operative named Jimmy Fletcher. Tall, handsome, and charming, Fletcher was perfect for the role. He presented himself as a fan, then as a friend, then as something more. Billie, isolated by fame and suspicious of everyone around her, found herself drawn to this man who seemed to understand both her music and her pain. What she didn't know was that Fletcher was recording their conversations, photographing her apartment and reporting her every move to his superiors. When she confided her fears about the government's persecution, he offered comfort while taking notes. When she shared her dreams of a quiet life away from the spotlight, he smiled and made plans to destroy those dreams. The intimate moments they shared, conversations about music, about pain, about hope, were being transformed into evidence for a federal case. The psychological toll of this betrayal, though Billie wouldn't learn the full extent of it for years, was immense. The one person she had begun to trust was actually working to imprison her. Even her capacity for love was being weaponized against her. The paranoia and isolation that would plague her for the rest of her life began during this period, when she couldn't tell friend from enemy, when every conversation might be her last as a free woman. Meanwhile, her romantic relationships followed their own destructive patterns, each one a variation on the theme of exploitation disguised as love. Her marriage to Jimmy Monroe, brother of the infamous numbers runner, brought her deeper into Harlem's criminal underworld. Monroe was charming and protective at first, presenting himself as someone who could shield her from the pressures of fame and the government's harassment. But Monroe had his own agenda. He saw Billie's talent as something to be managed and monetized, her fame as a tool for his own advancement in Harlem's hierarchy of crime and corruption. He introduced her to opium, claiming it would help with her anxiety and stage fright, but really seeking to make her dependent on substances he could control. At first, the drug seemed like a miracle, the crushing weight of performing night after night, of carrying the hopes and pain of her audience, of living under constant surveillance. All of it became manageable with opium's gentle embrace. The racist hatred that followed her everywhere, the death threats that arrived with increasing frequency, the knowledge that she was constantly being watched. Opium made it all bearable. But what began as occasional use soon became daily necessity, and daily necessity became desperate addiction. The progression was swift and merciless. Within months, Billie found herself unable to perform without drugs, unable to sleep without them, unable to face the reality of her situation without their chemical comfort. The woman who had once transformed pain into art now found herself consumed by a pain she could no longer control. Her second marriage to Joe Guy, a talented trumpet player, offered hope for something healthier. Guy understood music the way she did, could speak the language of jazz that was Billie's native tongue. For a brief period, their relationship seemed to offer the possibility of love without exploitation, partnership without power games. But Guy had his own demons. He was already struggling with heroin addiction when they met, and soon introduced Billie to the drug that would ultimately kill her. Heroin was different from opium, faster, more powerful, more destructive. Where opium had offered gentle escape, heroin demanded total surrender. Together, Billie and Guy created a private world centered around their shared addiction. They would disappear for days at a time, lost in drug-induced hazes that temporarily erased the pressures of their public lives. But even their private moments were being documented by federal agents who used their addiction as evidence not of illness, but of criminality. The most devastating relationship was with Louis McKay, a man with connections to the criminal underworld who presented himself as Billie's savior. McKay promised to help her get clean and rebuild her career, but instead he became her pimp and dealer, controlling every aspect of her life while profiting from her desperation. McKay understood Billie's vulnerabilities with predatory precision. He knew she craved stability and protection, so he offered both for a price. He managed her bookings, controlled her finances, and gradually isolated her from friends and family who might interfere with his control. Under the guise of protecting her from bad influences, he became the worst influence of all. The psychological abuse was as systematic as it was cruel. McKay would withhold drugs when Billie displeased him, using her addiction as a weapon of control. He would promise to help her get clean, then provide the very substances that kept her enslaved. He convinced her that she was helpless without him, that her addiction made her unemployable, that he was the only one who understood her needs. This period also saw the creation of some of Billie's most personal and powerful songs. God Bless the Child, born from a bitter argument with her mother about money, became a meditation on self-reliance and the cruel arithmetic of survival. The lyrics spoke to everyone who had ever been abandoned, but they carried special weight coming from a woman who had been abandoned by family, lovers, and country. Them that's got shall have, them that's not shall lose, so the Bible said, and it still is news, she sang, her voice carrying the weight of lived experience. The song became her signature during this period, a perfect distillation of her philosophy of survival in a world that offered no guarantees to anyone, least of all to Black women. The recording sessions for these songs reveal Billie at her most vulnerable and most powerful. Studio musicians who worked with her during this period described a woman who seemed to channel pure emotion through her voice, who could transform a simple melody into something profound and heartbreaking. Yet between takes, she would retreat into herself, the weight of her addictions and her persecution visible in her slumped shoulders and distant gaze. Her 1944 recording of Lover Man captured this devastating beauty. A voice ravaged by experience but somehow made more expressive by its damage. When she sang about needing a lover man, audiences could hear the desperation in her voice, the longing for something or someone who could fill the emptiness that drugs only temporarily masked. But they could also hear something else, a refusal to surrender completely, a core of strength that remained intact despite everything. By 1947, the government's noose was tightening. Federal agents had compiled enough evidence to arrest Billie on drug charges, but they wanted more than just a conviction. They wanted a public spectacle that would destroy her influence permanently. The arrest, when it came, was designed for maximum humiliation. On a cold morning in May, federal agents burst into the apartment Billie shared with Joe Guy. They tore the place apart, searching for drugs and evidence of other crimes. They found what they were looking for, enough narcotics to support serious charges. But they also found something else, evidence of the surveillance operation that had been targeting Billie for years. Letters from Jimmy Fletcher, photographs of her performances, transcripts of conversations she thought were private. All of it was there. A roadmap of betrayal that revealed the full scope of the government's conspiracy against her. In that moment, Billie understood that her persecution had never been about drugs. It had been about silencing a voice that threatened the comfortable lies America told itself about race and justice. The trial was a foregone conclusion. Despite her fame and the support of prominent musicians and intellectuals, Billie faced a legal system that had already decided her fate. The judge sentenced her to a year and a day in federal prison, but the real punishment was what came after. The loss of her cabaret card, which effectively banned her from performing in New York City's premier venues. The cabaret card system was one of Jim Crow's most insidious creations, a way to control who could perform where without explicitly mentioning race. Officially, anyone with a drug conviction was ineligible for the card required to work in venues that served alcohol. Practically, it was a tool for silencing troublesome black performers while protecting white musicians who used the same substances. Here was the brutal arithmetic of American oppression made visible. Billie Holiday faced persecution not just for being black in a white supremacist nation, but for being a black woman who refused to stay silent. She endured the double burden of racism and misogyny, targeted both for her race and for daring to speak as a woman with agency and power. The system that had failed to protect her as a teenage prostitute now painted her as the aggressor, the threat to social order. Prison was supposed to rehabilitate Billie, but instead it broke something essential inside her. Alderson Federal Prison Camp was a relatively progressive facility, but no prison could address the real sources of her addiction. The trauma, the persecution, the systemic racism that had shaped her entire life. She emerged from prison thinner, more fragile, and more deeply addicted than before. The woman who had once commanded stages with regal presence now seemed diminished, though her voice retained its power to move audiences. The loss of her cabaret card was devastating in ways that went beyond financial hardship. New York's jazz clubs were her artistic home, the venues where she had developed her unique style and built her reputation. Being banned from these spaces was like being exiled from her own life, forced to wander in a wilderness of second-tier venues and constant travel. Yet even in exile, Billie's influence continued to grow. A new generation of jazz musicians had grown up listening to her records, studying her phrasing, learning from her revolutionary approach to melody and rhythm. Singers like Sarah Vaughan and Dinah Washington openly acknowledged her influence, while musicians like Miles Davis spoke of her as one of the greatest artists of any genre. The 1950s brought both resurrection and ruin. Norman Granz, the progressive producer behind jazz at the Philharmonic, signed Billie to his Verve Records label and began recording some of her most acclaimed albums. These sessions captured a different Billie Holiday. Her voice was more limited in range, but somehow more expressive, weathered by experience but enriched by wisdom. The album Lady Sings the Blues, recorded in 1956, stands as both artistic triumph and heartbreaking document. Billie's voice, now gravelly and worn, brought new dimensions to familiar songs. When she sang What a Little Moonlight Can Do, the playful innocence of her youth was replaced by something deeper and more complex. A mature woman looking back on dreams that had turned to nightmares. But perhaps most powerful was her interpretation of Strange Fruit during this period. The song that had made her famous now carried the weight of everything she had endured. Her voice cracked with emotion as she sang about strange fruit, but now listeners could hear not just anger but exhaustion, not just protest but profound sadness for a nation that had chosen cruelty over justice. The comeback was incomplete, fragile, always threatened by her deteriorating health and continuing addiction. Billie suffered from cirrhosis of the liver, heart problems, and respiratory issues that made performing increasingly difficult. She would often arrive at recording sessions barely able to stand, held upright by willpower and whatever drugs she could find to function. Her final major public appearance was at a Carnegie Hall concert in May 1959, just 2 months before her death. The venue was only half full, a stark contrast to the sold-out shows of her prime, but those who attended witnessed something extraordinary. A dying woman pouring everything she had left into one final performance. Reviews of the concert described a voice that was barely a whisper, but a whisper that somehow carried more emotional weight than many singers' full-throated declarations. When she sang, "Please don't talk about me when I'm gone," the audience understood they were hearing a farewell, a final message from an artist who had given everything for her craft. The circumstances of her final collapse were as tragic as everything else in her life. Billie was found unconscious in her apartment, surrounded by the detritus of addiction. Even as she lay dying, federal agents posted guards outside her hospital room waiting to arrest her for the small amount of narcotics found in her possession. The woman who had sung America's conscience into existence was spending her final days as a prisoner, handcuffed to her deathbed. The irony was complete. Outside the hospital, fans gathered with flowers and prayers. Inside, representatives of the government were preparing to drag a dying woman to jail for medicating her pain in a society that had given her little choice but to hurt. Billie Holiday died on July 17, 1959, at age 44. Her death certificate listed cirrhosis of the liver, but those who knew understood the real truth. She had been slowly murdered by a system that could never forgive her for speaking truth to power. The woman who had worn gardenias like a crown was carried to her grave surrounded by those same white flowers, now monuments to a resistance that outlived the woman who embodied it. The funeral was a study in contrasts. Thousands of fans lined the streets outside St. Paul, the Apostle Catholic Church, many clutching gardenias in tribute. But few of the white entertainment industry figures who had profited from her talent bothered to attend. The woman who had integrated audiences across America was mourned primarily by the black community that had always understood her true worth. In death, as in life, the color line held firm. But here lies the question that haunts us still. Did Billie Holiday die from the ravages of addiction? Or was she assassinated by a system that couldn't tolerate a black woman singing the truth? The drugs that destroyed her body were illegal, but the hatred that drove her to them was sanctioned by law, Which was the real killer, the heroin in her veins or the hatred in America's heart? In death, Billie Holiday became larger than she had ever been in life. Her influence on subsequent generations of singers, from Frank Sinatra to Amy Winehouse, cannot be overstated. She showed that vulnerability could be strength, that imperfection could be more beautiful than technical perfection, that art at its highest level was not about entertainment, but about truth-telling. But perhaps more importantly, she proved that art could be resistance. In a time when black voices were systematically silenced, Billie Holiday sang with unflinching honesty about racism, poverty, and injustice. She paid a terrible price for her courage, but she never stopped singing her truth, even when that truth made her enemies of the most powerful people in America. The questions surrounding her death remain relevant today. Was Billie Holiday's persecution really about drugs, or was it about silencing a powerful black voice? Could someone with her talent have thrived in a more just society? What other voices have we lost to the same toxic combination of racism, poverty, and criminalization? And perhaps most urgently, if another Billie Holiday emerged today, another black woman who dared to sing about the strange fruit still hanging from America's trees, how would this country respond? Would we celebrate her courage, or would we find new ways to destroy her? The gardenias that once adorned her hair have become eternal symbols, but the hatred that killed her remains very much alive. Today, when we see viral videos of police brutality, when we witness the systematic persecution of those who speak out against injustice, when we watch as America grapples with the same demons that destroyed Billie Holiday, we must ask ourselves, have we learned anything from her sacrifice? Or are we still the same nation that handcuffed a dying woman to her hospital bed because she dared to sing about our sins? Her legacy lives on not just in her recordings, but in every artist who refuses to compromise their vision for commercial success, in every performer who uses their platform to speak out against injustice, in every voice that dares to sing about the strange fruit that still hangs from America's trees. But her death serves as a warning. The price of truth in America has always been paid in blood, and those who sing it do so at their own peril. The gardenia she wore in her hair has become a symbol not just of her elegance, but of her resistance, a beautiful flower that bloomed despite the harsh conditions surrounding it, that concealed pain while projecting power, that remained white and pure even as the world around it rotted with hatred. Like the woman who wore it, the gardenia was both delicate and defiant, lovely and dangerous, a thorn in the side of a system that preferred its black women silent and subservient. Perhaps that is Billie Holiday's greatest legacy, the proof that even in death a voice powerful enough to move the world cannot be silenced. The woman who was destroyed for singing about lynching trees left behind songs that outlived the lynchers. The artist who was criminalized for speaking truth created art that exposed the real criminals. In the end, which proved more powerful? The handcuffs that bound her body or the voice that freed millions of souls? The strange fruit still hangs from the poplar trees, but so does the memory of the woman brave enough to name it. And in a world still struggling with the sins she sang about, that may be the most dangerous legacy of all.